Hi there. Let me shine a light on the US-China relationship that not many people are highlighting. And that is, of course, that there is a history of oil being supplied to China under the cover of US protection and organization. Because oil has for a long time been sold for, let's say, $25 or something like that. And that was not a coincidence. That these oil countries, they didn't really want to trade it, and of course that lots of oil came from the US itself, but a lot of it came from overseas, and all that oil was basically controlled by the US, and the price was controlled by the US. When OPEC basically stood up and said, well, this is nonsense, we want to have an influence too, the price doubled. But that was never a problem for the US, of course, because they print a dollar, and the oil was traded in a dollar. And they went off the gold standard, so they basically had no limit to the amount of gold that they could buy, and the way they would grow and could prosper from that franchise. And that's what Summers realized, and he basically inflated the whole debt. Now my position is that that debt is meaningless. It's nothing. It's just a result of using the dollar as an instrument to get as much oil as you can into your economy. The problem with that is that that whole process changed the identity of lots of Americans that were very rich into something that's really unsustainable. That is really not going to continue unless there's a real conflict. And now, how do you trigger that conflict? Well, you have to, in order for there to be a conflict between individuals, they both have to think they're right. They both have to think they have a right to assert themselves. And the US bases that right, I think, on the fact that when China started to develop, it wasn't a world power. It couldn't, and the oil market was controlled by the US. The price was determined by the US, and US would never give that up, of course, because why would you give up a dominant position? There's no reason, you're dominant. But they did supply. They did allow China to get much oil as they did in dollars. But of course, then they had to manufacture stuff and send it to the US. You can look at it this way. That the US basically allowed China to access the oil in the market using the dollars under the protection of the US, under the determination of the market price by the US. And that was, of course, a result of the exertion of military influence by the US. Previously, before, and of course, basically the dominance of the US has been beneficial to China. And China has worked and received dollars, and they could buy all kinds of stuff for it. And if you look at it on the surface, you say, well, they received dollars and they're worthless paper and etc. That's true, but nonetheless, during the process, these dollars weren't worthless. They were always, providing supplies to China because all these commodities were traded in dollars. And I guess the U.S. realizes that. And thinks that, well, listen, why so serious all of a sudden about this debt and the deficit and the trillions of dollars that you have? You've been growing by using our oil. Now, and you know that the US is aware of this and taking action to protect its oil supply. And everybody knows that the US is basically contesting that with China by occupying Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. But now, what many people don't realize, of course, or maybe they do, everybody knows that this whole quantitative easing activity increases commodity prices. So what does it mean? Well, it basically means that the dollars that this China has, with which it buys the oil, are becoming worth less oil. So the quantitative easing activity and the completely destruction of the dollar, that activity is but the maintenance of the petrodollar, so that it still exists, which of course will exist because that's why the US is in Iraq and that region to ensure that it happened, means that China is not only of course somewhat less able to contest oil supplies from the Middle East or access them, but it's also cut off from the oil that it would buy with the dollars because the value is decreasing and imploding. And I think that is the main reason why they're angry right now, because they're really driven in a corner in an energy war that has physical representation, but also has a monetary component, which is much less obvious. And the people that do this monetary activity, so the Bernanke's, they will say, well, I'm doing quantitative easing, etc., to revive the economy. No, I'm doing it basically to strangle China, to wrest China of their ability to buy the oil, to reduce their purchasing power as an economy, and maybe the whole economy will implode. That's fantastic, because that comes back to the fact that that the US has developed a mentality that it should be the world dominator and the primal force, and etc. And that's basically a software mistake in our psychology, that we can develop an identity that is superior to our actual capabilities. That's simply unsustainable. But based on that superiority and that sense of justice, of existence, or justified existence, we will simply go to war if it's being threatened. And I think that's going to be really hard. It is a hard fight, but it might intensify. And so I think China is not angry about not getting anything back for the dollars. It is angry about the fact that the US is encroaching on its energy supply and is not allowing it to grow, or is not going to allow it to grow, and is obviously trying to destroy it through instability caused by this dollar value reduction and energy deprivation, let's say. But we have to see how that pans out. But I think this perspective is interesting, so that's why I thought I'll just talk about it a little bit.